Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning and welcome to the German Council on Foreign Relations morning briefing on geopolitical challenges. I'm Henning, Hoff, executive editor of Internationale Politik Quarterly. Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine entered its 575th day, 757. The fight over global opinion went to the United Nations this week with US President Joe Biden, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz all giving strong speeches. Meanwhile, in another instance of might-beating right, Azerbaijani troops moved against the Armenian enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh, aiming to bring the territory under its full control. They are likely to push out ethnic Armenians, potentially causing a humanitarian crisis. This morning, however, we focus on Europe's economic security and how the EU can best respond to China's policies. In her State of the European Union speech last week, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announced that the Commission would look into Chinese electric vehicle subsidies in response to fears that Chinese-made EVs will flood the European market. This ties in with wider questions regarding a potential European economic security strategy for the EU. And the circle to square, of course, is how to protect the EU's critical infrastructure as well as critical elements of its economy, like the automobile sector, while avoiding full-scale protectionism. To discuss this, we have a great panel with us this morning. We will be hearing from Alicia García-Herrero, who is Chief Economist for Asia-Pacific at the French investment bank Natixis. She's also a senior fellow at Bruegel, the economic think tank in Brussels, and holds various other positions. Great to have you with us again, Alicia. Good morning. We also have Noah Barkin with us. Noah is senior advisor at Rhodium Group and a visiting senior fellow with the German Marshall Fund's Asia program. Many of you will know him as the author of a highly insightful monthly newsletter called Watching China in Europe, and as a regular contributor to IP and IPQ. Good morning, Noah.
Good to be here, Henning.
And last but not least, Guntram Wolff is with us, Director of the German Council on Foreign Relations, who does not need an introduction here, but I should mention that Guntram had a chance recently to brief ECOFIN on a European economic security strategy. Good morning, Guntram.
Good morning, Henning.
This morning, we will rely again on our discussion approach. I'll be putting questions to our panelists, and after some discussion on the panel, about 30 minutes in, we will be opening for your questions and comments. To pose a question, please raise your hand, introduce yourself, and put your question in person to the panel. You're also welcome to submit questions and comments via the chat function. And with a word of thanks to Milan Nitsch, who has been instrumental in organizing these morning briefings, and to Jan Stöckmann from the Director's Office, who is supporting the series going forward, as well to our colleagues in the events and communication teams. Let's start. And my question, maybe first to Noah, is what is your reading of Ursula von der Leyen's announcement that the EU Commission will look into Chinese subsidies for electric vehicles? So what's your reading of this?
Well, Henning and Guntram, thanks first of all for having me. First of all, I think we have to put it in perspective. This announcement. This is not the first anti-subsidy investigation launched by the European Commission targeting China. There have been many of these in recent years, and this is what the Commission does. And the fact that it has launched an investigation does not automatically mean that it will end up with tariffs or duties on Chinese EVs. Although my view is that we are likely to end up with something like that. Second, of course, I think it's of course an important signal. It shows that the Commission is not going to stand idly by if cheap Chinese EVs are flooding into the European market. This could destroy the development of the EV market in Europe, the nascent European EV development. And I think the precedent of the solar industry has been very played an important role here. I think the Commission is determined to be proactive, to be preemptive in this case. it is going to take roughly a year before this investigation results in specific measures. So I think the view from the Commission was it's important to act now before the market share of Chinese electric vehicles gets out of control in Europe. And I guess the last point I would make, I just got back last night from a trip to Paris and to Brussels. I can tell you there's very strong support for this in France. That probably won't surprise anyone. But in the Commission, there's a strong confidence that they have a good legal basis for pursuing this investigation. My sense is that industry is more spooked. I don't think that's necessarily a surprise. I think everybody is asking themselves, how might Beijing respond? I got a lot of questions about this. And, you know, this wasn't announced sort of on a Friday afternoon. It was announced by the president of the European Commission in a major high-profile speech. I think it's important that the EU Trade Commissioner Valdis Dombrovskis is heading, I think, tonight to China to sit down with the Chinese interlocutors and explain the reasons for this. So I think we need to be very vigilant on a Chinese response. I don't think this is going to come immediately, and if we do get a response, it will probably be asymmetric. But I'll stop there and pass it back to you, Henning.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Alicia, what's your reading?
Well, first of all, thanks for the invite. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to sound boring because I quite agree with everything Noah said, and I was reading Our Glance, written by Bruegel. Basically, it's kind of a quick op-ed reacting to this, and it's very much what Noah said. I would first highlight one thing, Noah. You said that there's many of these, of course, anti-dumping investigations. This one is different, though, because it starts from the Commission. So it's not an industry-led investigation, as was the case for solar panels in early 2014, the very famous case, which in a way involves the auto industry, because, you know, the rumors are that it was indeed to save the auto industry that Chancellor Merkel basically pushed the Commission at that time, Karl de Gucht, Commissioner for Trade, away from pushing further at the WTO. And I think that shows the difference. The difference is that this is a multi-billion, 40 million jobs industry for Europe. And I think that's why it starts from the Commission, because this is strategic for Europe and much more than any other investigation. Now the question is, why now? I guess the answer is we have a huge bilateral deficit by now. We already had it last year, 2022. It's going to grow massively in 2023. So for me, it's like we've come to the realization that our trade with China is not going to improve. China's exports are plummeting, minus 14+% in July, minus 8.8 in August. And we don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. We're not expecting China's market to grow for us anymore. So I think the Commission is kind of saying, look, if this is what we have, we may as well save basically our markets. The auto market here in Europe, and perhaps even, you know, overseas, in the sense that this could have a major impact on the EV market sector, industry in China. Two things to add is that, first of all, and this is important, some of our companies do receive the subsidies we're now claiming are part of the dumping reality. Yeah, because I think Volkswagen, Tesla, anybody that is incorporated in China has had access to these subsidies. So, you know, of course, the industry is not pushing, probably, or at least not the industry in the mainland. And I think the other thing to note is that the China's reaction, and I finish with this, I think we need to watch Apple very carefully, because for a long time, China touching Apple was a kind of the atom bomb. I mean, when we were going through the possible retaliations, I think Noah would probably, Apple was at the very end of the, because that would have been first lots of jobs in China. I mean, really a big thing too. But they're starting. They're starting in very subtle ways, whether it's officials cannot use Apple phones or iPhones, or they cannot, or now, you know, the iPhone 15 is not of good quality enough according to social media in China. You know, you can see that this is denting, obviously, having an impact on the stock price, Apple stock price. So my feeling is that they may retaliate softly but painfully, rather than with a big announcement. And that could be European automakers are not up to the standards, or who knows. This happened to Toyota, if you recall. I mean, whatever part of the engine was not okay, and you name it. So I'm expecting a subtle but harmful retaliation, because I think China is not in a position now to show strength boldly and clearly. And we need to watch for these signals to know where they will come from. And that's all.
Thank you very much. Very interesting to watch Apple. I'll quiz you a little more about the possible Chinese reaction in a moment, but let's go to Guntram now. What's your general reading of the announcement?
Well, I mean, thank you, Henning, and thank you to Noah and Alicia. I mean, I quite agree with both of them, and I'm actually also just coming back from Brussels and can confirm that the dossier that the Commission built is a strong one. I mean, that was confirmed to me from several sources, and it's a strong one, and it is indeed led by the Commission, not by the industry. And it's quite obvious why that is the case, because industry itself is quite involved in China, and as Alicia pointed out, is getting subsidies. So for industry to raise the case is actually quite complicated. Now, let me just perhaps zoom out and explain why I think it is the right approach to actually go down this road and do an anti-subsidy investigation under WTO rules. I mean, the first point here really is to make this is an attempt to really go, in a sense, the multilateral road, right? I mean, so you really try to look at the existing rules that we have, the WTO rules, and see whether within those rules you can show that China is, behaving in a way that is incompatible with these rules. Now then, the counter argument is, well, but the WTO is dead, etc. Well, but it's not dead, right? I mean, we have the rules, and much of global trade is under these rules. If China wants to object to a decision, it can go to the WTO, and the arbitration court doesn't function, but there's now an alternative court, which sort of an interim court in the absence of the US judges, to which China is party, right? So we can go the multilateral route. And I think the strategic decision to do it the multilateral route is also a very explicit decision, trying to avoid being drawn completely into a global subsidy race, right? Because the alternative response, of course, would have been, okay, China is subsidizing, so let's do the same thing, right? I mean, let's go down and subsidize as much as China does. And of course, we have these kind of tendencies within the European Union. We've seen it with the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which is a very significant subsidy and tax reduction program in response to the Chinese state-driven economy, and Europe has been struggling. What is the right approach? And I think the decision to use the multilateral rule, multilateral instruments, and the anti-subsidy instruments is an attempt to try to also salvage at least the nucleus of the multilateral framework. Now, having said that, I quite agree that And the worry in Germany is, of course, very big that there will be retaliation against the German car industry. And what you hear often when you talk to senior German policymakers, but also industry, is that basically this decision to go after China with an anti-subsidy instrument is also very much French inspired, because the French do not have the car industry there, and it's our industry, and so basically it's all everybody colluding against the German car industry. And there, I mean, I do want to emphasize a point that also was made by Alicia quickly, is the sales of the exports of German cars to China have been on a declining path for some time. Of course, German companies do produce in China, but for China to retaliate against a German company in China that is basically employing Chinese workers is a much more complicated decision than sort of retaliating against imports from Germany. So I'm a little bit less worried than perhaps many German industry representatives about the direct consequences for the car industry. I think that can actually most likely be managed. So I think overall a good decision in the multilateral spirit, trying to avoid a complete outright subsidy race that is very complicated for the world, that's very complicated for Europe, that's fiscally extremely costly, and that ultimately means a lot of taxpayers' money going to rents for shareholders instead of being used for public goods. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Guntram. We already heard sort of from Guntram right now, Noah, that Germans are worried, or some see it as sort of as a move against German car industry. But sort of, you told us Paris is delighted with this move. Sort of, how does it fit in your view into Germany's approach to China overall?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's always hard to know with this government, because we saw, of course, Robert Habeck, the economy minister, come out and praise this. I'm sure there are different views within the government, and I haven't gotten to the bottom of all of them as I haven't been in Berlin. But I would be surprised if German officials found out about this investigation for the first time while watching Ursula von der Leyen's speech. My assumption is that Berlin was aware that this was coming, or that there was a possibility that this was coming. We did have media reports before the summer indicating that the Commission was considering this investigation. And look, I think it reflects growing concern about the competitiveness of European industry, and not just because of China, but also because of the IRA, as Guntram mentioned. And these concerns are perhaps most acute in Germany, which has been hardest hit by the war in Ukraine and the cutoff of cheap Russian energy sources. So, I mean, if you look at the headlines these days, it's all about Germany being the sick man of Europe again. I think that is probably overdone, but the concern is there. And if you look at Ursula von der Leyen's speech, not just the announcement of the investigation, but the overall tone of the speech, it's clearly she's pivoting from a focus on new rules, regulations, restrictions. I think everyone has saw the speech that she gave in March on China, and the joint communication that came out in June, which is advocating for tighter export controls, outbound investment screening, things like this. So I think there is a bit of and I certainly picked this up in Paris, a bit of a backlash against a commission which is perceived to be very generous with the rules and the restrictions, and not being active enough in supporting industry. Now, Germany probably views has a different view than France about how to best support industry. I think the French obviously have a much more interventionist tradition, but I think there was also support in Berlin, given the struggles in the economy here, for a more not only a more defensive approach, protecting European companies on the single market, but also, moving away from a policy that has been very focused on restrictions. One person pointed out to me, CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, the plan by the European Union to tax high polluting products coming into the European market, and comparing that to the IRA, and they say, which of these two big initiatives is most helpful for the domestic industry? I think the view is that it's the IRA. So I think the Commission was under pressure, and I think Germany, the German government is obviously very concerned about developments in the domestic economy. So my sense is that there is an openness to a more muscular approach on this, but certainly the German enthusiasm is not as extensive as you'll see in France.
But a willingness sort of to get a little tougher with China, is that right? I mean, that would be sort of in taking with the China strategy, which was published in July, and the way sort of I'm hearing from Front Office is that this is sort of, it's not an all new policy, but a different tone. Sort of.
I mean, I think the German China strategy lays out an approach which foresees, a bit more of a muscular approach to more of a government role in promoting diversification, in defending Germany's and Europe's economic competitiveness. So I think this fits into that basket to a certain extent. I think people will be nervous here, especially industry, and they're concerned about Chinese retaliation, as we've said. So there is some nervousness, and we know that if you go back just a few years, if you look at the solar precedent, there was real intervention by the government of Angela Merkel to prevent this, and there was active lobbying at the time by the German car makers. So I think that has changed. I think there is a willingness to take steps that perhaps in the past were seen as too provocative or likely to elicit retaliation from China. I think, we're not over that fear that China could hit back, but I think we're maybe more willing here in Germany to accept some of the consequences of that, because we've seen what happens when Europe doesn't do anything, and the results are not good.
Thank you very much. Guntram, you reacted to one of the comments.
No, I mean, I mean, look, this is a very big topic, obviously, and so I do want to bring in also Alicia. But I mean, just to say, as Noah is pointing out, the world is changing, right? I mean, we've been in this relatively clear world with international rules, and we have basically, I mean, conceptually, you can think of this as a world in which now we have at least two uncooperative players, right? I mean, China is uncooperative, meaning it massively distorts the global economy with subsidies and with protectionism. And certainly the US is also uncooperative, right? I mean, its policies are certainly not in line with a global rule framework. And when you have such a world, I mean, then basically it can make sense under certain circumstances to also play the uncooperative player. Now, there's really three big problems with this uncooperative approach. So many basically focusing on massive domestic subsidies plus protectionism, right? I mean, so there's three big problems, right? I mean, the first is the fiscal cost is actually very high, right? I mean, so we spent 10 billion on a chips factory in Magdeburg, another 5 for TSMC. So that's just like 15 billion spent on subsidies where, it's actually for an outside observer quite difficult to understand what you really gain from it, from these 15 billion. Also, given that the transparency of these transactions is not very high, it's really difficult to judge this. But still, I mean, the fiscal cost is 15 billion, right? I mean, so this is the first problem. The second problem is you have a big issue with the domestic internal market of the European Union, right? I mean, so if some countries do this big time and others don't, of course, this leads to distortions within the single market. And the relaxation of the state aid framework in the European Union is creating, therefore, some issues. So if we were to go down this road with massive subsidies, we should ideally do this at the European level, right? I mean, we should basically create a European subsidy transformation fund or something of that sort, and have it run out of Brussels and not sort of country by country, because that really can lead to distortions. Now, the third big issue is, and I pointed that out also in my briefing to the EU finance ministers, is that the world consists of more than 3 players, right? I mean, there is at least conceptually one more player, which I would call the global south or whatever you want to call it. And of course, shutting out these countries from major parts of the value chains creates a lot of resentment in these countries. And so I think our role as European Union certainly needs to be to continue engaging very much with the global south. I do think it's actually a good bet on the future to invest in these countries and to really work with them and try to keep openness as much as possible with them. And therefore, in the subsidy race, yes, we will need some subsidies, but let's think very carefully about what kind of subsidies are needed, how do we use them, how do we restrain them and use them essentially for narrow areas where Chinese dominance is actually so big that it becomes a security issue. So that was, in a sense, the essence of what I put forward to the ministers. I mean, yes, we will need some subsidies, but if you just open the floodgates, I mean, it's going to have major negative consequences. Do it narrowly focused on areas where there are real security concerns. Otherwise, try to use as much as possible multilateral anti-subsidy instruments and other ways of protecting your industry.
Thank you very much, Guntram. Alicia, I would be really keen to hear your view on this, sort of whether the EU has sort of its priorities right. And also, you already alluded to that in your first answer. Watch Apple. You told us sort of what kind of retaliation or reaction do you expect from the Chinese to this European initiative, if it comes to pass, which we all, I think, assume that it will happen.
Okay, so on the first question, what should we do? I think we're being contradictory. I understand. I mean, we can applaud the Commission for what the Commission has dared do in comparison to the past. But the Commission dared in 2014. We just stopped the Commission. You know, it's not about the Commission. The Commission has been doing this so many times, and somebody comes and says, stop the process. So yes, based on history, I would say we can applaud the Commission to keep on trying. But the point is, we're being contradictory now, as opposed to 2014. And let me explain. In 2014, as Guntram said, we still had our state rules and, state aid rules. We were still in the, multilateral understanding that subsidies were not a good thing to do, that industrial policy was not the way Europe saw the world. Now we are having our own subsidies, but we are saying China is subsidizing an industry. So it is very easy to come after us, let alone the US. So I feel that we're using old-fashioned instruments for a problem which is now happening in a very different Europe. Now, of course, what other instruments can we use if not anti-dumping? Well, maybe if we acknowledge that we cannot stop the subsidies because China is subsidizing, the US is subsidizing, maybe we need to align forces, in my view, with the US and elsewhere. India, of course, producers of raw critical material producers, extracting nations and refining possibly as well, to create a partnership. Now, that partnership, do we need subsidies? Your question. Maybe we could, maybe I doubt, but we could give it a try, Noah, to convince the US of trying some kind of carbon pricing, cross-border carbon pricing, meaning price-led reaction rather than subsidy-led reaction, because it would be less costly for everybody. And if we were big enough to create this environment where you do have those in no cross-border carbon tax, etc., there would be an incentive. So, I think we need to really move on from multilateralism. I'm sorry to say this, but the point is we're being contradictory. We say X, but we do Y, and we tell people don't do Y, but we're doing Y. So this is not going to fly at the end of the day, because we are abandoning, Guntram, this anti-subsidy theology, if I may say, for that, or at least ideology. So that's the first question. The second question, what can China do? So, and there I have a point before we even start, because you said, if this anti-dumping is confirmed, I mean, if we end up with countervailing duties. No. The problem is China knows with Europe that it needs to react before, because we are experts in actually taking files out of the WTO. So China is going to push us to the cliff, showing us the way to the cliff. Maybe not literally throwing out from the cliff, but showing us what will it look like if we continue. That's what China is going to do. So China will not need to do much. This is, again, what I was trying to say here. But it will show to our governments how bad it can be. And then we will probably, maybe not, because this is a 14 million jobs industry, but maybe we will withdraw the case. And I think that's why we need to watch at the subtle messages that we might be receiving. Beyond the one I mentioned on Apple. Apple is basically bad name of European companies operating in China, bad name in whatever way. Yeah, that's kind of the Apple story. But there's another story, which is that, as we know, we cannot substitute solar panels, even with wind turbines for that matter, 64% imported from China. So our colleagues, my colleagues, already no longer Guntram's, but our Guntram's ex-colleagues and my colleagues have estimated something of the order of 10 years to be able to live without solar panels from China, for example. So the question is, what did China do already before, when these rumors that Noah was talking about, that maybe we would do this, started? Immediately they placed solar panels as a whole in the license license list. So they could not easily, I don't think they will, but they could show the ability to stop solar panels, exports of solar panels. One way to do it is to say that they need to accelerate their own decarbonization. No questions asked, because we're telling them they need to speed up decarbonization. So our position is very tricky, because we're not doing what others are what we are fighting against, anti-subsidies, and plus we don't have a reaction to China's preemptive retaliation. I don't think we can react easily to not importing solar panels or anything like that. So they could just stop it for technical reasons for 2 weeks and, just show the pain. And that would be enough for us, in my view, to react really aggressively, backtracking on what we just did. That's all.
Thank you very much, Alicia. I think it's time to get our audience involved as well. 2 hands up. Philip Hilsementel, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for this for these insights. I know that a question is supposed to be a short sentence with a question mark at the end, but as someone who's been in the clean tech industry for 14 years and has helped establish 2 battery companies and had a front row seat to the decline of the solar industry, because I sat in the Solon building from 2010, and allow me to have a few more comments. I think, what, and Guntram alluded to this, I mean, the world is no longer as it used to be, and I think German industry is having a very hard time adapting to this. For basically the entire post-war period, we as Germans, but Europeans as a whole, we've had this business model of importing security from the US, cheap energy from the Gulf and from Russia, and essentially finished products from China. And this is coming to an end, and it's not coming back. And of course, German industry is very conservative. And as a German myself, I'm a bit critical because German industry is very good at optimizing things, but it's actually not as good as being innovative as we like to think. And it's certainly not very good at reacting to changes. And so what we do need to do, I'm entirely convinced that we need a really strategic European clean tech policy, but it needs to be strategic and it needs to be at the scale. And so subsidies is one thing. So subsidies work, but if you turn off the tap on the one hand, you have to turn up the tap on the other hand, otherwise it won't work. So there's a point here where, okay, with the car industry, we have a point where we can play catch up. Actually, with the solar industry, we're now in an interesting position, and we can learn from both the mistakes that we did with the 2014, which was too little, too late, and also from what the Americans are doing with the IRA. So right now, you're right, we would need 10 years to Alicia, to grow up a solar industry. But thanks to the IRA and thanks to this pig cycle that we're currently in, we now currently estimate that there are about between 40 and 120 gigawatts of solar panels sitting in European harbors. Last year's European installation was 80 gigawatts. So, and that's driving down prices. And this is why solar manufacturers in Europe are complaining, because solar panels here cost 15 cents, in the US they cost 25 cents. And there's a big discussion on what we could do. So actually, this would be a good opportunity where we can say, hey, let's take these really cheap solar panels, on the one hand, and finance our energy transition on the cheap. But at the same time, let's really build up a European solar industry. But what we need to, for that to do, is we need to go be different. It can't just be a subsidy on price. We have to differentiate ourselves. It would have to be something like, it has to be 100% renewable from the start, everything we do, and not just on balance, but really proven kilowatt hour. And then you have to have, like, of course, full, like the IRA has, you have to have a proper human rights record and all the rest of it. And then you have maybe a little bit of a package together, but then that's one part. And then you go to the poker table. But then, of course, you have to talk to China, and you have to say, okay, China, okay, this is not going to go on like it used to be. Let's talk about it as adults, and they won't have an interest in having a competition, because, and this is something that also the German solar industry, I don't think, understand right now. We're in this pig cycle, and a lot of Chinese solar companies are going to go bust now, because they ramped up production. They didn't see the IRA coming, and essentially all those modules were going to the US. The US closed the borders. Now they're in Europe. And that's actually a strategic opportunity, one which we should use. And I would be very interested in the views on the panel on this.
Thank you very much. Let's go to Hartmut Fischer. And introduce yourself, please.
Yeah. Greetings. My name is Hartman Fischer. The 25% of the CO2 emissions of the EU come from transportation, which is largely combustion engines. And we're not coming down at the speed by far that we would need to and want to. So at this point, it seems like it would be good if somebody wants to flood, quote unquote, the European market with cheap EV vehicles. It's something we want to get ahead on that count. And so it's counterintuitive to me to talk about raising tariffs or combating that instead of subsidizing or by other means, promoting the EU domestic EV car production, so it comes down to a similar cost level as the Chinese imports. So together with both the domestic production and the Chinese imports, we make a big leap ahead in the electrification of the transportation sector, which, by the way, is also a cost reduction in car operations. And why is that not on the table in our discussion here?
Thank you very much. Interesting point. Where we mentioned the 40 million jobs sort of being related to the domestic car industry. That is I would think, but I'm sure our panel has more ideas. There's also one question from the chat. I'll just throw this in as well. The first one, Michael Sanders has asked, sort of given the strong position of China when it comes to batteries, whether sort of and the measures under discussion could actually be effective. So maybe these three questions, and I don't know who would like to start. Noah, perhaps.
Sure. Very good questions. I'm not a green technology expert, so maybe I'll take the final question about how effective these measures will be. I think there is a big question about whether duties on Chinese EVs can, how much of an impact they can have on the big picture. China dominates the electric vehicle supply chain, from raw materials like lithium and cobalt to batteries and EV production, where they are a few years ahead of the Europeans. But I think we do have to remember, and this is a point that Alicia made, China doesn't have an interest in getting into a major trade war with Europe at a time when its own economy is struggling. I think with the export controls on germanium and gallium that Beijing announced, it's clearly raising a flag and saying, look what we could do if we decided to go down this route. And I think in the past, this has been enough to dissuade Europe from pursuing trade measures like this. We've talked about the solar precedent. Could China put up the prices of certain inputs into EVs where it has a dominant position? I think that is a possibility, and I agree with Alicia that it's not going to respond with some big in-your-face announcement. It will be tweaks here and there that have a real impact, which signal to Europe what China could do if it got serious. But I think we do have to remember that Europe does have some leverage. Europe hasn't been very good at using that leverage in the past. I think when confronted with a government in China that is willing to use all the levers that it has, both formal and informal, Europe has often shied away in the past. But I think this is also a sign, this anti-subsidy investigation, that and the fact that von der Leyen announced it in the State of the Union, that I think Europe is becoming a little more confident about using the leverage that it has, and I think we'll probably see that on the upcoming trip by Valdis Dombrovskis to China. I think there's a real commitment to sitting down with the Chinese interlocutors and explaining to them why Europe is doing this. There are economic reasons why China may not retaliate with full force, and there are geopolitical reasons, of course, the need to keep Europe close and keep the U.S. and Europe from working too closely together.
Thank you very much, Guntram.
Well, I mean, a few reactions. I mean, I think the first point about the speed of the rollout is actually an important one, right? I mean, there is the emission aspect to it. So how quickly will we be able to bring down our own emissions? And of course, there is the energy cost dimension to it, which we haven't talked much about. But of course, German industry at large is currently confronted with a very high energy cost shock. And it's clear that Russian gas won't come back. So the really tricky question for sort of not just specific industries, but for the entire industry, the more energy intensive you are, is how quickly will you be able to get cheap renewable energy. And so I think that is certainly, if you sort of think about the order of magnitude, what is more important, to have your own solar industry or to have cheap electricity? I would certainly opt for the second and not the first, right? Because the solar industry is a small industry, and at the end of the day, according at least to some numbers I've seen by my former colleagues at Bruegel, I mean, the IRA in the US is not a major producer of jobs, right? I mean, it has created 100,000 jobs or something like this since it started, which is really nothing in an economy which has created per month something like 300,000-400,000 jobs in the last 2-3 years. So this is really, I think, important. It's the electricity price, bringing that down with a fast rollout of renewable is really important. Now, the second point, and Philip Hills-Menzel, we've been discussing that, I think, on many of these calls, is sort of this question: can we get back solar, right? I mean, can we actually get it back? And if you read the State of the Union speech by Ursula von der Leyen, I mean, she really talks much more about wind, right? And I think she basically talks about how can we make sure that we keep wind, right? Which I think is probably the more realistic point to make at this stage, given that we have a very strong and competitive wind industry that faces wind turbine producing industry, but that faces a number of sort of headwinds, but that is still, I mean, dominating the European supply. I think 85% of the windmills built in Europe are from European companies, right? So I think we really have to think very carefully about how to keep that industry. Bringing back solar faces major headwinds, as you know, and I think the two big headwinds are, of course, energy costs and labor costs. Now then, I think you're right, and there, I think that needs to be said. China does distort its solar industry production with forced labor and with coal power plant based electricity prices. So when we buy a solar panel from China, we actually pollute because it's been built with coal fired electricity. And so if ideally you want to take out those two effects, right? But even then, I'm not sure whether it would be price competitive to build a major solar industry in Europe. Perhaps in other countries, Vietnam, Indonesia, it might be more useful to do it there. And I certainly do buy the argument that you want to diversify and not just have China producing that stuff. But I don't see this immediately going here. I would probably focus on wind. And look, on the transportation, a very quick point, Hartmut Fischer. I mean, yes, I mean, I agree on the, the first point is really we have the emission trading system, which will be extended to the transport sector. Yeah. And so I think that's the main instrument to bring down emissions in the transport sector. And it starts working now. It will start working as in the next years. Now, then, do we need Chinese electric vehicles for this? I mean, we actually do have also a domestic industry, and I do see the point that destroying the domestic industry, which is a major industry, because China subsidizes it so much just for the sake of the environment, I don't think that would be politically acceptable at the end of the day. So that's why I'm overall in favor of anti-subsidy instrument. Sorry, I spoke too long.
No, that's fine. Alicia.
I think, frankly, not much to add. Most of the stuff has already been said, but I do have, I think, a question more than anything else to Philip, because I think what he said about this excess capacity of solar panels that are blocked, European solar panels blocked into the US, is a very interesting story I had not heard about, because it would make our lives more simple, at least given the prices you suggested, to at least reduce some of the excess dependence. Yeah, I mean, the latest figures are like close to 90% of our imported solar panels come from China. So I think that's a humongously large dependence. I don't think anybody can justify that even on price concerns, because Philip, you're the expert, but what I've seen, whether it's actually the UN for Africa, or even there's a report on Southeast Asia, basically the cost is not too different. It is true that China holds patents that makes probably their solar panels more efficient. I mean, no doubt about it. But I think over time, I think price alone cannot justify such huge dependence, in my view. So how long it will take, I don't know, but I don't think any country in the world will want to have 80% of the solar panels imported from a single country. It's not only about Europe. It's like, if we don't react, we'll be the only ones, because everybody else is reacting. Indonesia is reacting. Indonesia is producing solar panels. So how come we're not going to, I would not say only produce in Europe, but perhaps produce elsewhere? But for God's sake, I mean, I hope that the industry thinks of, and our governments, of some different solution, and just import everything, no matter the risk, just because it's cheap from a single country. I mean, I thought, I would imagine we've learned that lesson already, given what we experienced, unfortunately, in Europe very recently. But I'm not saying it's comparable, but we don't really know. But there's the issue of Taiwan. There's so many risks out there that, to me, make it non-feasible, none at all, to import everything from China. It's just, no matter the price, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Now we've got our two sort of questions from the audience back. Let's go to Hartmut Fischer, because I think you will probably want to come back on a comment Guntram made, sort of what is politically sort of acceptable. Is that right?
Yes, thank you. I'll make it short and sweet too. I used the word flooding. That was misunderstood. What I meant is, if we have cheap electrical cars from China and more expensive electric cars in the EU, that we shouldn't be raising the price of the Chinese cars. We should be lowering the price of the EU cars to strengthen the industry here and speed up the transformation. That's the key point I was making, and that would preserve the jobs as well. With the ETS, that's a good point. There's other instruments of doing that. I'm doubtful whether there's going to be enough political will to really strongly reduce the certificates because that drives up the price and makes energy expensive both for private, for citizens and for companies. So I think the approach would make sense in the clean tech areas to bring down the price in the EU instead of raising the price of imports.
Thank you very much. Philip again, but only 30 seconds, please.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't agree more with Hartmut on this. Yeah, I mean, and just one comeback to what Guntram said. Energy costs is not so much about the cost of solar panels, and we need to be and all the other stuff. It's really a much more a question of market design. The reason why energy cost is going up is because we're throwing away a humongous and rapidly rising amount of energy. 4% of German energy was curtailed last year, and it's going up like those corona curves. Yeah, and so there's a question there, and then I mean this is a whole different ball game. But you can have cheap or relatively competitive energy in Europe, and it's not about a price. It's about, but as Alicia said, I think we have an opportunity here, and the same goes for cars, right? I mean, we have to make the if China is willing to finance our energy transition, great, but let's use this opportunity to build up some resilience.
Okay, thank you very much. We've got only 2 minutes left, so I wanted to give our panel a chance for one final question, maybe also looking at the subject in a sort of more political sense. I mean, we've discussed last week about how sort of forces on the far right are on the up in across Europe. Sort of what is it just in a word or two, for better or worse, are we going to see a more protectionist EU? Starting maybe with Noah again.
Thanks, Henning. Well, look, I think Europe is dealing with a China and a United States that is willing to flout WTO rules, and I think we're seeing pressure. I think France has been at the forefront here of well, we've seen France pushing the EU to get more aggressive and not to sit idly by while other big powers are flouting WTO rules and be the ones that are sitting you know, with moral certitude in the corner and getting pummeled. So I think, you know, we are ultimately, this anti-subsidy investigation is about preventing the demise of the European car making industry. I think we have to recognize that, and I think Europe is going to be under pressure, certainly going forward. You know, we don't know what's going to happen in the U.S. election. But it's going to be under pressure to bend its rules, and we'll see where that leads us. But I think that pressure is not going to subside going forward, either from China or the U.S.
Very much, Guntram.
Oh, just one word. I mean, if we think we can prevent the rise of the far right by subsidizing people to consume big electric cars, I think we are mistaken, right? I mean, this is not the people that vote for the far right. I mean, so I mean, that's why, you know, I would really insist on let's better use a cost instrument like ETS, make some cars, make the big cars more expensive, and then use the revenues and basically give them to either the poor or on a per capita basis back to everybody. But I mean, much of these climate subsidies actually go to those that consume the most energy, and that's usually the well-off.
Thank you very much. Alicia, last word to you.
Yes. So how to stop the far right in this meeting? I don't know. I hadn't thought about this question, but let me tell you. that China has a way. I don't know whether it's exactly the far right, because for me they are there, but that's a different topic. The point is, how do they sell the transition? And they sell it very simply. They don't talk about the transition. They talk about the jobs related to the transition. That's what they do. They talk about industrial policy, why they're number one in EVs, in batteries, in solar. And they show basically that this is number one, a money-making machine. And then on top of that, they can benefit from those exports to decarbonize more cheaply, because they basically come once the cost per unit is lower, in a nutshell. And I think this is the way they sell it. So I wonder whether we should not be less moral, if I may say, about it, and perhaps put at the forefront this idea that this is a new industry, and that that it is actually also very positive in terms of welfare, or at least competitiveness, and therefore welfare, once you are able to export all of these goods. Maybe that will convince more people down the road, as we see the costs basically related to others selling the goods to us that we need for decarbonization. It's very, very easy, once we start, we just saw Sunak and the UK, to have somebody say, oh, China is benefiting from this, not us, and get the whole thing, like diverted, and mixing this idea of nationalism and the China fear. So I think this is one big risk for our decarbonization. So maybe we need to accept it and in a way be more balanced, and also think industry-wise, not only objective-wise. Yeah.
And with that, I say thank you to our panelists. Guntram has already left us. Noah Barkin and Alicia Nasia. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning, and see you next week. Please watch out for the email invitation, and I wish you all a very good morning.